S3, welcome to our next literacy lesson where we're focusing on speeches, and this is the third lesson on speech writing. Now just as a reminder though, although this is one lesson video, this might be taken over quite a few lessons, okay, so don't panic when you see the amount you have to do in one lesson video. Just as a reminder then of things to consider, we have looked at picking a topic and we've looked at how to structure our speech, and now we're going on to write our speech. So when we're writing our speeches, it's really important to consider your audience and your purpose, because that's going to determine the tone of your speech, and tone is really important, okay? Think about your message, right? What do you want to get across and how do you want it to come across? Do you want to use humour? And remember that you can write about something that's sad and occasionally bring in a bit of humour. These things work, okay? Do you want it to be serious? Do you want it to be emotional or uplifting? Do you want it to be all of the above? Because remember, as I said a minute ago, they're not exclusive of one another. You can put them together, and it can work really well if you have something that's really serious and occasionally bring in a bit of humour. If you remember the John Franklin Stevens speech, and he used loads of humour to put across a really serious point, and that made him more personable and made you want to listen more. So humour can work really well in a speech. Or do you want to maybe come across as really angry because your audience are the people that aren't listening to you? Okay, so there's loads of things to consider, and it really depends on the topic, your message, the audience, and why you're writing the speech in the first place. So have a think about that. It might be that you have a chat with your teacher or your friends about that just now, or just pause the video for 5 minutes and just think to yourself, what am I trying to actually achieve here with this speech, and what tone should I be using? Should I mix the tones up? Will that work for me? So pause the video and do that now. We're going to talk a bit about your writing style, but it's really important to remember that you might need to go over some of this with your teacher, or for instance get a wee bit more support with your writing, okay? This is just an overview. Things that you might want to think about though would be things like directly addressing the audience. When is it appropriate, when is it not? The power of three is always really powerful in a speech. So go back to the different speeches that show you the power of three. We haven't really touched upon imagery in speech analysis, but imagery can be really powerful. If you use like an analogy to point something out, it could be part of your anecdotes, for example. The imagery can work really well. I just wouldn't litter your speech with it to the point where people forget what you're talking about, okay? You want to be concise and to the point as well. Repetition. Remember that climactic, powerful ending to the Emma Gonzalez speech. Repetition is so important. Personal anecdotes. Think about the John Franklin Stevens speech and how he used anecdotes from his own life to point out how important his life was. So these are the kind of things you could add to your writing style. But the main thing I want you to get from this lesson is that a speech should show off your personality, okay? It's really important that you come across as, I keep using the word passionate for a reason, but really passionate about your topic, and your sense of your own self, how you fit into this topic needs to come across really well, okay? Also think about how you present information, right? Think about how you're presenting your statistics. I always talk to my classes about the fact that whenever you see something that's advertising that something is 95% fat-free, but imagine if they flipped it around and said 5% of this product is pure fat. You suddenly wouldn't really want to have it. But they're focusing on the positives, and it's really important that you learn, depending on what you want to say. So for instance, if something is 27%, now, depending on what you want to talk about, you might say that's almost a third of whatever it is. Or you might want to say over 2/3 are nothing to do with that. So there's ways in which you can tweak statistics to make what you're trying to say even more powerful, okay? And if you notice when you've been reading the speeches so far, they've not had loads of statistics. They were only put in when they were really powerful. And sometimes they were wrapped up in an anecdote or wrapped up in an analogy, and that's another thing that you could do with your statistics. So you could have your statistic and then use an anecdote to explain it and say, in reality, this is what this statistic means, okay? Projections. If you are doing anything at all to do with something that might affect you in the future, then it's really powerful to project and say, if things don't change, this is what's going to happen. Or have a really positive spin and say, if we make these changes now, this is what we're going to see. So they can be really, really useful when it comes to presenting information. Highlighting important quotations, but again, don't fill up your whole speech with other people's ideas, okay? One is plenty. So think about important quotations from really well-respected people that you might want to add in. And again, you might want to then talk around the quotation and explain why it's so important. Other persuasive devices, think about the different techniques that you might use. Remember, these are all techniques that you either have studied in RUI or might study in RUI, okay? Hyperbole, when you exaggerate to make a point. Just be careful with hyperbole in speeches, because you don't want to come across as ranting and not very knowledgeable about your topic. But every now and again, hyperbole can be really powerful. Now, you might not have come across litotes before. That's where you have a deliberate understatement. So that's quite useful if you're using almost dark humour to prove a point. But if you've not come across that before and you're thinking, I've not heard that before, I'm not confident with it, it's not one you really need to focus on now, but certainly when you get to Nat 5 higher level, you might want to start using that technique. Repetition, repetition, repetition. Okay, if you repeat stuff, especially if you combine your repetition with the power of 3, people are going to remember what you are trying to say. Rhetorical questions can be really, really powerful. That's when you don't require an answer. And a rhetorical question is particularly persuasive because you're already assuming that everyone agrees with you. And psychologically, that makes people start to think, well, I must agree with them because it's assumed that everyone would agree with them. And I don't want to be the odd one out. So rhetorical questions can be really, really cool to use. Word choice and emotive language. Probably the most effective way of getting your personality across. Okay? If you are disgusted, show that through your word choice and emotive language. If you are empowered and excited, show that through your word choice and emotive language. Again, these are techniques that you might need to have a refresher on first before you think about using them in your writing. I'm going to then leave you with the success criteria for a speech in S3. And what I've done is I've tried to break it down into different benchmarks for levels 1 to 4, and then got you to think about tone and vocabulary, structure, and engaging the reader. What I haven't put down there are the tools for writing bits to do with editing your work. So your teacher might give you another layer to the success criteria, but I thought I'd just keep it specifically to speech writing, because it might be that you're writing a speech to deliver and you're not actually going to necessarily get the speech formally marked or assessed, but you will when you deliver it. And I was thinking about speech word count. Now, these are not official benchmarks, so don't panic if this doesn't link in with exactly what you do at your school. But roughly speaking, I would always say to my pupils that we are trying to progress to the point where we could write 1,000 words at National 5. So if you're working at level 4, you're probably moving on to National 5 the following year, so you need to get used to working towards 1,000 words. And then I've gone down the way. But again, if that doesn't suit what you're doing, this is something you can negotiate with your teacher, and your teacher might change the success criteria with you anyway. So we've talked about the topic and research, we've talked about planning, and now we've talked about writing style. So now all there's left to do really is to get writing. Good luck, everybody.